to be with you all today. And this webinar is organized by the Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism. More specifically, it's Climate and Environmental Working Group, and we are very happy to host you today. Very quickly, boring housekeeping rules reminder before we get to the content. So please, we ask you to kindly keep your mic on mute for the duration of the different presentation we're gonna hear, and then there is a moment for Q&A discussion at the end of the webinar, where you can of course open your mic and the video and ask your question. I'll guide you through that after the different presentation from our panelists. Just to flag also that this webinar is being recorded. I hope everybody is fine with this. If not, you can please flag that in the chat and we'll manage. But that's of course because many people wanted to attend, but we know it's a very busy time, so we are hoping to be able to share the content of the discussion further away. Good. That being said, let me briefly introduce you to this webinar and then give the floor to our very skilled and amazing panelists. So we wanted to have that conversation to collectively discuss and reflect on the interconnection between the climate, environmental, ecological agenda and the financing for development conference, more specifically the 4th financing of development conference that's happening soon in Sevilla. Because we know whether you're working on economic justice, tax justice, debt justice, climate justice, finance is on everyone's radar, and that is happening more and more. So on one hand, of course, we all know that the financing gap for SDGs is growing and enlarging as we go. We have different, of course, estimates and different evaluation, but we speak about 4 trillion of additional investment that are needed in developing countries alone every year to meet the 2030 agenda. So it's a clear and starting problem, but on the other hand, we see a continued refutation of global North country to honor their past and current commitments when it comes to climate finance, to development finance, etc., etc. And that's true actually across the board, no matter where you look and in which multilateral fora you're engaged in, this trend of dilution of historical responsibility is a stark reality. Of course, COP29 is one among other examples of the perfect illustration of that, as I said, dilution of historical responsibility from global North countries, but also at the same time, the constant push for full solution, including a very stark push for private sector first approaches and the shift of responsibilities onto developing countries. So COP29, Baku, the terrible climate finance goal we saw, but of course that's also a reality when you look at biodiversity spaces and the latest biodiversity COP that required a COP bis happening soon in Rome to actually achieve consensus on finance discussion. It's
sorry, Rebecca, sorry to interrupt. Do you mind slowing a bit down for the interpreters?
Sorry. Sure.
And just a quick reminder for everyone, we have interpretation to Portuguese and Spanish, so if you want to use that tool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, apologies. That was part of the housekeeping reminder. So please, yes, feel free to use the interpretation, and I'll slow down to make sure you understand in different languages. So I was saying, so this dilution of responsibilities and push for full solution is a reality in various forums, climate spaces, biodiversity space, but also, for example, the UN plastic treaty negotiation. On the other hand, more money that we are all asking for to scale up public finance in the scale of the trillion to finance adaptation, loss and damage, just transition, but more money fueling actually a system that's at the root causes of the different crises won't solve anything. So it's also about changing the rules and changing the systems, because we know that the current economic and financial systems that we are facing are rooted in extractive and colonial legacies that are actually the direct causes of the different ecological crises we are facing. So that has, of course, to be factored in the conversation. It's about closing the financial gap on one hand, and I know many of you have been working very intensively on that front, but it's more importantly about changing the rules. And so therefore, it's really critical to connect the different agendas and the different conversation. So how to factor in systemic economic justice ask within climate environmental discussion spaces, but also how to make sure ecological integrity is part of the different economic and financial negotiations. So that's where we were really at in our reflection and looking at FFD as the fantastic opportunity to connect the dots between the different agendas and make sure we are increasing the pressure for more fair, equitable finance and economic systems. So you may have followed or not, because it's not yet really on top of the news, the latest FFD negotiation. So the co-chairs have issued a zero draft, I think a few weeks ago. And we are now heading to the third preparatory committee happening next week in New York. So it's actually a very good moment to reflect on those questions, right? What is the role of FFD when it comes to climate and environmental conversation, knowing, and the panelists will, of course, go deeper into that FFD is not a pledging conference. It's about, as I was saying, about systemic transformation and ultimately about increasing fiscal and policy spaces for developing countries. And in parallel, it's also important to assess where climate, environment fit in the current draft text, but also maybe more importantly, where those questions fit within countries' position, right? Because of course, a draft text is kind of a compromise of the different positions, but it would be interesting also to get a political overview of where, how countries do position themselves about those questions, knowing that climate and environment are cross-cutters. So we can see reference across the different topics, but also they have now a dedicated section. And then maybe more importantly, in the bottom line of the conversation we wanted to have today with you is how to engage collectively within the FFD process, of course, from maybe some organization perspective, but also from local grassroots indigenous perspective, because we have to all together take ownership of those processes and fight, as I was saying, for more justice, whether it's in the economic or climate spaces. So we have a bit less than 90 minutes in front of us. So we'll start with a few presentations from our amazing panelists, trying to resituate what FFD is about, what FFD is not about, where does ecological integrity fit in the conversation, what is the link with the climate spaces, and again, what is the perspective of local and indigenous leaders to make sure we have this collective understanding. And then we'll have, as I said earlier, time for a question and answers. So that's the program today, and without further ado, I will introduce you to our first panelist who will give us a perfect introduction of the financing for development negotiation and the role of civil society. So we have Flora Sonkin, who is a policy researcher on economic justice at CID International and part of the civil society FFD Mechanism facilitation team. Flora, the floor is yours.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for introducing so well. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all on this exchange. So I will try in a few minutes to present a little bit of the FFD, the Financing for Development process history, and also talk about a bit of the current hot topics that are being discussed towards FFD4, which is the fourth conference on FFD that's happening in July, as Rebecca mentions. Yeah, if you can pass on to the next slide. It's okay, I guess. I don't know who is dealing with the slides, but yeah, you can pass on to the FFD context and history. I can start. So I guess I just wanted to situate us a little bit on the framing of how we see the financing for development process, which, as Rebecca was mentioning, is not a pledging nor a fundraising exercise, despite its name, Financing for Development. There could be this perception that is a process to find more money to finance the SDGs implementation, because it actually has been linked with the SDGs, especially since the last conference that happened in 2015. But it's actually meant to create the fiscal and policy space for developing countries to finance their own development in a sustainable way. And it very much looks at our economic system in this interconnected way between all different areas, such as trade, debt, private finance, and also cross-cutting issues. And that is why it's actually a very unique process, because it's hosted by the UN, being a place where all countries have a voice and a vote, and it has a mandate to discuss global economic governance issues, but also it has human rights and climate issues and gender issues at its core. So that is why it's a very unique process. And it actually is looking at the vicious cycle of inequalities and at the root causes of our asymmetries, both within and between countries. So as we all know, the current rules of our global economy are very much designed and reproducing this vicious cycle of inequalities, where export and growth-oriented and private sector-led oriented development models in many countries in the global south is actually only enabled and possible because of the exploitation of cheap labor, extraction of natural resources by corporate actors that are in many cases based in the global north. And so this is, as we know, a reproduction of a colonial system that has actually just taken new shapes and forms. And the FFD process has this historical root arising of the discontent of developing countries about these systemic shortcomings and problems with the international financial architecture. So it came about right after the Asian financial crisis in the end of the 90s. And the first Financing for Development conference happened in Mexico in 2002, which is called the Monterrey Consensus. And this conference was very much an attempt to recover the voice of the UN in global economic and financial system normative conversations and rule setting. And the idea is that the UN had been systematically marginalized by the IMF and the World Bank in all these global economic discussions. And of course, because global north countries have more votes and a bigger voice in those institutions, and the UN being a space where the issue of democratizing global economic governance remains at the core. And this is what actually the FFD process is about. It's about democratizing global economic governance, and that is why it's a process where the G77, so the group of developing countries, is very much at the leadership, and it's a group with whom we engage in the FFD conversations, trying to shift the economic policy decision-making away from the IMF and World Bank, where developing countries don't have much of a say, and bringing these discussions to the UN. Yeah, as I was saying, the FFD process is very much ultimately about allowing developing countries to fulfill their right to development. So it's meant to work towards coherent and interconnected rights-based content and norms and recommendations on global economic governance, and deal with the systemic and historical inequalities that define the system that we're in. And so through different topic areas, it addresses all these issues in more holistic manner. So as I was saying, there is conversations about domestic resource mobilization or tax, trade, private finance, international development cooperation, debt, technology, and some of the key conversations that we are seeing now evolving in the current process are, as you might know, the discussions on tax. So there is actually a parallel process that is happening on the UN Tax Convention process that we are very much supportive of, and has an incredible leadership of the Africa group, backed by a very strong tax justice movement. And the idea is through the FfD4 to just continue supporting this process to exist, and not actually trying to bring it to the current negotiations, but just supporting its own track as it's been going on, and to try to also avoid these single niche tax initiatives, such as the wealth tax that we very much support, but we see the importance of having this happening within the process of the tax convention. I won't have time to go too much into this, but just to flag that this is one key issue, and of course very relevant to the struggle for climate justice as well, because of course when countries are able to fairly tax corporations, for instance, big oil corporations, they can mobilize resources for their own development, to invest in public services, and become less reliant on debt. Which means they can, for instance, choose to move away from export commodity dependencies and extractivism, which is often a trap that they are faced and forced to continue maintaining because of the heavy burdens of debt that they need to pay back. So that is another actual key point in the conversation towards FfD4, which is very much, again, a consequence and a product of an international financial system that was very much designed to facilitate new colonial extraction. And this is why that continues to be a really challenging aspect of all these discussions on international financial architecture. And then through the FfD process, we have been advocating for the establishment of multilateral solutions for debt. So one of the calls that has actually been recently increasingly echoed by especially the Africa Group and other G77 members is the establishment of a multilateral debt workout mechanism at the UN. And we've been hearing these calls being more strongly echoed in the last two preparatory committees. Another area that I think is really relevant to climate, and that has been very strongly coming up through the preparatory process, is trade. And I've pasted there on the slide one of the last speaking points and inputs to the process by G77, which is talking about eliminating unilateral coercive economic measures, which include environmental related measures, such as, for instance, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, which is something that may appear to be a measure that is under the guise of environmental protection and climate protection, but it's actually very detrimental to developing countries and their right to development. So I think this is a key issue that maybe Emilia or other colleagues that are talking further about the climate intricacies with the FfD process will go into. But I think one of the key points that we want to bring to this conversation is this duality, or this the complexities between climate and ecological considerations and the right to development to the global south. And so here with the FfD process, we very much highlight the historical debt that the global north owes to the south. So the right to development is very much a key point of the conversation, including issues, for instance, of critical minerals and other topics that relate to these unfair trade practices between global north and south. So this is a bit of the context of the current conversations of the process. And I think on the other slides, I just wanted to share a bit of how we organize as civil society and how to engage in the process. So this is just to share with you this introductory toolkit, which is on our website, that I think can be a helpful tool for groups that are new to this process to explore. So the civil society FfD mechanism is an open platform for civil society organizations to coordinate our positions and to become stronger in this process of advocating with one collective voice. And within this group, we are working with different work streams that are dealing with different topics, different pillars of the FfD thematic areas. And one of them is climate and environmental issues and finance. And this is the work stream that's organizing this webinar. But there are other working groups working on the other thematic pillars, such as debt and trade and etc. So through this website, you can further explore these tools and also find on how to engage with us. Yeah, sharing here the Chronicle, which is another advocacy tool that we use to engage both with member states and communicate more broadly about our issues. And I know this has also been coming from, inspired by a practice that climate groups have been doing on the COP. And yeah, social media, of course. But this was just meant to share with you a little bit of how you may want to amplify the messages or engage with the content. But basically, as the other panelists will share, there's a lot of relevant topics that intersect between climate justice and economic justice, of course. And I think that there are many different tools that you can use to engage with us and then amplify each other's messages. So this was just meant to share how to engage. But I think I'll leave it here in terms of introducing the process, and maybe if there are questions I can answer afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. I think that was a perfect scene setting for us to understand what is FfD is all about, but also what are the interconnection between climate, environmental, and economic justice negotiation, but also maybe the limits of those conversations. So I think that's a perfect scene setting. If you have any question for Flora, you can always put them in the chat, or as I said, we will have a moment to discuss those later on in the webinar. So moving on and welcoming our second panelist on the question of where does ecological integrity agenda fits in the context of the FfD, we have Emilia Reyes, who is Program Director of Policies and Budget for Equality and Sustainable Development at Equidad de Genero, Ciudadania, Trabajo y Familia. Apologies for my Spanish. Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, everybody who's joining today. We wanted to frame a bit how we are working in the FfD space, the agenda of the ecological integrity. I want to make a very strong difference that this is not only about climate justice or the climate change agenda, but it's more broad. We're bringing the ecological integrity issue from the point of view of planetary boundaries. So as you know, we have 9 planetary boundaries. I will read them now. One of them is climate change, for sure. The other one is biosphere integrity, which can also sometimes be recognized as biodiversity integrity, or sometimes people refer to it as biointegrity loss. But this topic of the biosphere integrity or biodiversity integrity involves 2 fields as well. One is genetic diversity, that refers to the prevalence or extinction of species. And the other is functional diversity, that refers to ecosystems integrity. So we know how, because of the economic system as a whole, the entire ecosystems have been threatened. So these are 2. These are actually cross-cutting, but we have more land system change that is mostly referred to forests integrity. Then we also have biochemical flows that are previously termed nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. The 5th is novel entities, and here it includes chemical pollution, and this is also where the discussion on plastics falls. There is also the big issue of ocean acidification. The 7th is fresh water use. The 8th is atmospheric aerosol loading. And the 9th is the stratospheric ozone depletion. Of course, all of these are interconnected. Up till now, humanity has surpassed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. And of course, I'm guessing climate change. Last year, we know that it was the first year that we went into 1.5 degrees, although it was not an average temperature. But this January, it seems that estimations are saying that we went into 1.75. So we are very much on the verge of going into 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries being surpassed in the safe space. So this is very dire. And of course, when we say that this is not only about climate change, what we're trying to do is trying to be rigorous about what are the type of policies and measures that need to be tackled, and not only rely on the carbon metrics that the climate change official discourse is trying to push us towards, because there are many other impacts that we need to tackle. So from a point of view of a structural solution, we really need to look at the bigger picture and to understand that even if now we solve the climate change problem, humanity is still going into collapse, and collapse the world and collapse nature and the biosphere cycles because of all the other planetary boundaries being surpassed. So the overshoot of the planetary boundaries is so dire and they're so interconnected that we can also go into tipping points that will follow the others and pull the others into this interrelational collapse. So this is why it's very important to have the bigger picture. So when we're talking about this takes us to the international regime, in which we know that there are many UN entities and treaties that are dealing with all of these issues. Rebecca just mentioned, for instance, the plastic process. UNEA is dealing with many of them, but we also have, the interrelation of the Three Sisters Convention on Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Desertification, etc. So we really need to be mindful that we're not
Hay que tener en cuenta que no estamos hablando solamente del cambio climático ni de las finanzas climáticas cuando hablamos de FFD, porque es una agenda estructural que se ocupa de todos los ciclos completos de integridad bioecológica. Esto es realmente importante porque el FFD no es un proceso.
Normative dimension is how we shift the rules of the game of the economic system. And this is why, if we take a step back, we know that the root of the problem, of the ecological problems, is capitalism. And so when capitalism is at the root of the problem, we know how the function of capitalism in this international order is that we have an international division of labor. We also have a sexual division of labor. And we know that then those are into play. So there is an extraction of land, energy, resources, time, and labor of global north countries, from global north countries into the south. And this is very important because this is why we talk now about colonial appropriation of the atmosphere, or atmospheric colonization, in which we know that 92% of excess carbon emissions are responsibility of the global north countries. But this is a broader agenda, ecological integrity. We're talking also that there is an ecological imperialism linked to this. Not only the north extracts resources, land, energy, water, everything, energy from the south for the consumption of the north. We also know that the waste is being returned to the south. So the south is not only subsidizing the development of the north, but the north is protecting their own ecosystems, and then they throw away our waste so that our ecosystems are also suffering the loss. And so this is also a form of imperial domination, because then we are left with the resource of actions of emergency all the time, and dealing with what is not responsibility of global south. And I want to include also the unpaid domestic and care work of women, because when we're talking about an economic analysis, we're talking about the primitive accumulation, meaning that capitalism in itself doesn't start when the commodities are taken and so that the worker is adding value through their work. There is a previous step in which the social reproduction is happening, where women are doing their unpaid labor, but also where capitalists are extracting and stealing from nature all of these commodities, and they think that there is an external process outside capitalism in which all of these bad effects are going to happen, but we know that there is no externalization. The planet is on the verge of going above its limits, and we know that if all of humanity would consume as global north countries, by 2050 we would need 9 planets. So there is evidently no externalization. And this is really important to bring the dimension of imperialism, because we talk now of green imperialism, in which you know how the discourse of climate change has been used to strengthen imperial ties of the global south through these so-called carbon metrics, in which they are imposing these techno fixes, like geoengineering, or like all of these false solutions and dangerous distractions that the climate justice movement has been alerting about. But this is the main discourse in the media and the global north countries. They say, oh, on behalf of all of the green processes and greening the economy, we know that we are coming with another era of mega projects on steroids, mega extraction. And so this is very important to be alert of the discourse of why is this only climate change being pushed into the larger system and not dealing really with a concern of the ecological integrity overall. So I don't want to undermine the climate change agenda. I want to say that we need to see it from a systemic point of view in relation to the economic system, so that we are warned about what is the type of system change that we really want, in which, of course, climate change is part of that concern. So just wanted to say that FFD has, Flora has already mentioned some points of entry like public finance and private finance. Those also are addressed from international and national point of view. And so, of course, in the issue of public finance, we always talk about tax. And at the national level, we want to expand the fiscal floor so that countries have funding for, public services, social protection, of course, climate and ecological action, ecological integrity and restoration. But the fiscal agenda also comes paired up with many proposals that are part of the green imperialism proposals. For instance, just carbon taxes or carbon pricing without really minding of the fair shares agenda or the right to development, as Flora was mentioning. So it is really important that from the point of view of this international capitalistic order, we wonder how are we pushing, for instance, for subsidies or to phasing out of fossil fuels without considering this fair share? And I know this is part of the analysis of the climate groups. We're just restating how FFD and the economic justice movement stands in alliance and solidarity with those demands. And we're also applying them in the bigger picture of FFD. But of course, on this issue of public finance, the issue of debt comes to play. I know Mariana will talk more about the issue of debt, but we're very mindful as well about how climate finance being 70% of climate finance being loans. And so we're very much dealing with this agenda as well in FFD. But also in the issue of international finance, of course, there is this primacy and discourse of monopoly capital. And this is why we are warning about financialization. And well, I don't have enough time to explain all of the linkages with all of these agendas, but it's very crucial that we see also how all of these ecological integrity agendas have impacts and are related to each of these points on FFD. So it's not just about the chapter that relates to the ecological and climate elements, whereas we really need to go deep into each of the chapters. For instance, on the monopoly capital, there is always a push for mega projects on the name of development. And so there is also this international cooperation agenda in which our colleagues are talking about ODA debt from the global north. And of course, the debate, I know Mariana will go more into this ODA versus climate finance. In the trade agenda, of course, I'm very happy that Flora brought the unilateral coercive measures and sanctions, because now precisely this is the risk when we're only talking about climate. When you have the climate Green New Deals and measures on transition to renewables, of course, that means that there is a larger extraction of minerals in the global south. And they call it critical minerals because they're critical to them for increasing monopoly capital. But we need to be mindful of what is the transition that we're calling for in the south. Is it really that we are the ones who need to transition? And why are we jumping on the wagon? Or what is our interpretation of the transition that we want? So those are bigger questions, and we just wanted to problematize. But also in the trade regime, it's really important to know that there is a tool called investor-state dispute settlements, in which the last years, 70% of the ISDS globally went against countries of the global south, precisely for trying to carry out their environmental commitments. So this is global capital monopoly that is suing governments in the global south. And 90% of those actors who are suing the global south are global north countries. So these are technical tools that we can push in the FFD to avoid, to have countries step out of ISDS clauses. Of course, in tech, there is a lot of things to discuss. You all know the discussion on technology and climate, but all of these issues are again related to all of these discussions on biodiversity and ecosystems integrity. And for instance, the systemic issues, we have some points of entry. Yes, let me finish. We have some points of entry, for instance, in regulating the credit rating agencies, with the Yasuni project, the referendum, 2 days later after Ecuador decided that they were going to keep the fossils in the ground, the credit rating agencies punished Ecuador. So these are all related, and these are economic tools to undermine the South through imperial tools. Just want to mention finally that the main problem that we see in the climate finance agenda from the FFD perspective is that it is a definition that is only referring to the money that goes from the global north to the south. But if the main emitters are in the global north and they want to count all of the money that the global south needs to transit out, but if the main emitters are the global north with their production and consumption patterns, why is there not a finance agenda linked to the global north? So this is a major problem because everything is falling again into the discourse of the responsibility of the global south. And we have said, yes, the global south needs money, but then there is this huge gap in the UNFCCC to discuss the climate finance agenda of the global north that is actually more dire and more relevant and more urgent. And so I think the only element that I want to finalize is that the climate movement has had important proposals to the economic justice, such as the cap and fee and dividend agenda. This would be useful not only to fossil fuels, but actually for all of the commodities in the global south in a larger picture to uphold the biodiversity integrity. And just want to finalize that there are not all of the vision that we have is a monetized economy. We have the non-monetized economy, and that's why we always say also that indigenous peoples are upholding the economy, subsidizing the economy by upholding 80% of the biodiversity in the world. For us, that is a macro agenda, and this is why we're also inviting our next speaker to speak about that. So thank you so much for joining, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you so much, Emilia. I think that's also a very useful reminder of the different concept interlinkages, but also limits of the different conversations. So I think it's, again, a great scene setter and a good foundation for the future conversations. Building on that, we have now Mariana Paoli, who will continue those explanation and deepening the links between ecological integrity, but maybe for you a bit more specifically on the climate agenda linkages with the FFD processes. So Mariana is Global Advocacy Lead at Christian Aid, and she's also one of the co-coordinators of Climate Action Network Finance Working Group. So very much on top of those discussions as well. Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone from Brazil, where I'm currently in. I'd like to share some slides to guide our conversation. Just bear with me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
but not yet in
fantastic.
slide mode.
Yeah, just okay, good. Right, so why is financing for development relevant for the climate agenda? I guess to some extent, a number of us that have been campaigning for years in the COP spaces and with all the outcomes, the frustrating outcomes we've seen from Baku, very much the agenda and opportunity that we have in the financing for development space is to align the narrative about reclaiming the role of public finance to deliver climate and development action. And that's especially because it is an opportunity, because this kind of conference, is, as Flora and Emilia mentioned, is an opportunity to focus on and challenge the financial structures required to transform the economies and achieve sustainable development. So that's really that opportunity to make the system more, democratic, accountable, transparent, and in the public interest. So, and especially it's important because FFD being rooted in the principles of global justice is really about shifting the financial flows. We know that more than 2 trillion flows from the south to the north and vice versa. So it's really about connecting the agenda of transforming the system. So when, for example, a number of groups came together last year in the Pay Up campaign, the campaign to really transform the financial system, well, FFD is very much the space to drive that agenda, connecting the dots between the TED, the tax, the governance agenda, etc. As Gutierrez mentioned, we all know that the current international architecture reform is not fit for purpose, and FFD can create that momentum narrative to transform and deliver that kind of agreement. Flora was mentioning already a bit about the history, how it all started in Monterrey. So this next one in Seville will give us the opportunity to connect the dots between the climate and the FFD agenda. So just, I know it was already been mentioned before, but just to recap, it is really important for the climate community to have in mind, first, that it's not a pledging conference, right? It's not about raising the money, but it's really looking at the structures. Second, it's not just about the delivering of the SDGs, but looking at the wider financial architecture. And the third is that it is a UN space where all governments are represented, but it's not just a UN conference, but it can create the mandate, right, to create other UN spaces. And it's a really important element for us to make it different. So what is in the agenda? There are a number of different issues, ranging from the global financing framework, tax through domestic public resource mobilization, private business and finance, of course, international development cooperation, trade, debt, and under systemic issues, we have global economic governance and global financial systems and science and technology. Now, as also Emilia was referencing, we know that gender and climate finance are cross-cutting issues. So it's not as something per se, but how should maybe the climate community engage with FFD? I think the first biggest commonality that we have, one of the fights that we have in the climate space that we have to look at FFD, is how can we challenge the private sector first approaches. We all know how private finance is insufficient and limited for mitigation. It often neglects adaptation and is completely inadequate for loss and damage. And what we have seen much as a result of the COP29 in Baku is that lack of commitment of developed countries to deliver their fair share, and instead really maximizing and having that kind of private sector first approach. So one of the fights that we have to really challenge the whole narrative of what was the economist Daniela Gabor called the Wall Street climate consensus, which is the proliferation of the financial instruments like public and private partnerships, blended finance, guarantees, all the enabling environments, which is also very much a narrative that international financial institutions, multilateral development banks have been adopted, and more climate finance delivered through those mechanisms just won't work, and especially what we have seen in the Baku outcomes, that beefed up role that MDBs are playing, the bigger and better approach is actually, is hindering, not helping the climate and development agenda. So that's the first commonality we have to work in our narrative. The second one is debt. Debt is an essential element of FFD. A number of economic justice groups have been working on the debt agenda, on debt cancellation, but especially an opportunity to create a framework under the UN for a convention on sovereign debt. And so the whole demands in terms of, calling for a multilateral sovereign debt resolution mechanism, really challenging the approaches of that of the IMF and the World Bank, look in terms of debt relief, etc., is a very important pillar. The second one, we know, and we know it from the experience from how the 100 billion were delivered in Copenhagen. Most of the climate finance has been provided in the form of loans, including commercial loans, for example. So we know that the climate finance can worsen the debt crisis. And we came out of Baku with a number of essentially not a penny of secure, how much ground-based finance will be delivered. Big question. It's very likely that moving forward, in the climate outcomes of Baku, more loans will be provided. And in fact, given the overemphasis in private sector, the narrative from Baku has shifted that it will be developing countries blamed for not creating those enabling environments to create more, to allow more private finance, etc., in their spaces. So, and that as a key way to fund climate development will exacerbate that crisis. Now, the third thing we have to look into what is present both in the climate spaces and in the FFD is really that push on the false climate solutions, and within that, we have also not just the private sector first approach, the increased role of MDBs, but other debt-inducing mechanisms and debt swaps, for example, that are largely used. So again, this is a very important driver and connection we have to support that economic justice groups have been fighting on. From the debt cancellation, there's this 2025 is the Jubilee year. There is a big debt campaign happening at the moment. And also support for kind of like specific legislation in New York and London to deal with private creditors. Now, it was also mentioned the third pillar. So we had private sector first, debt. The third one is the connection between tax justice and climate justice. So FFD is an opportunity to actually support the current negotiations of a UN tax convention. And it's really important have that because this is the space where all countries can participate in equal footing. It's really about shifting the norms in terms of not just dealing with the tax dodging, avoidance, evasions, illicit financial flows, etc. But this is actually an opportunity to move from, for example, OECD rules to more democratic spaces, but also looking at other innovative sources of finance. Now, the fourth one is about the importance of FFD to actually challenge what is central in economic governance, financial governance today, which is the fact that most of it is concentrated in the hands of the global north. So democratize economic governance. So that's very much at the heart of the FFD process today. Back when the Monterey Consensus happened in 2022, there was an attempt to reestablish the UN as the right forum for international economic cooperation instead of the IMF and the World Bank. So how can we actually increase voice and participation of the Global South in economic decision-making? That's actually a very important mandate for FFD. And that's really important for us in the climate community when we see how climate finance is channeled, right? We have, again, challenging the role of MDBs, looking at actually more democratic systems. We have the loss and damage fund, the green climate fund, the adaptation fund. We have a number of other UN-based mechanisms that can help deliver that. So we have the zero draft, which with a number of points is speaking to our agenda that we have to bear in mind. I think the whole debates in terms of the global architecture are there. About the UN Tax Convention, we have language on that legislation. We have the scope in terms of working on that, responsible borrowing and lending, and also something good on SDRs. Now, on climate and FFD in the zero draft, I just wanted to call the fact that we had some language that is helpful, other less helpful, like the recognition that climate finance is not keeping pace with the rising needs. There is a clear reference for climate finance to be new and additional, and that's really key. The additionality of climate finance to order and be based on CBDR. In essence, climate finance shouldn't be just about the 0.7, should be a much bigger GDP to actually include those climate needs, not in competition with development. The second, there is a commitment in terms of enhancing new and additional grants-based finance or high concessional finance, but it is not really explicitly mentioning grants for adaptation and mitigation, for example. The zero draft, interestingly, also calls for scaling up loss and damage fund contributions, but it's not really, for example, saying that the fund for responding for loss and damage should be replenished in a frequent basis. Unfortunately, it also promotes a number of the finance solutions I was mentioning, like the debt swaps, risk insurance, and bonds. But it also mentioned the climate finance architecture as a way to drive changes and need to put sources under the FCCC, but talks about fragmentation. So just wanted to call your attention to that one. I think Flora already was explaining the next steps forward. We're just before the third session in the prepared committee, which is in February. We have a number of other opportunities to move that agenda forward in terms of we have another session in April, and then the negotiations in June. And I can't strengthen out how great it has been, the collaboration that a number of climate groups, environments have been having under the FFD CSO mechanism, and I would really encourage everyone to join that agenda. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to say more when it comes to our debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Good explanation of where this climate specifically fits into the FFD negotiation. So you showed us that that it was a cross-cutter across different topics, but also that there was a specific section with good and bad, as you were saying. And of course, that piece of the conversation has to be resituated in what Emilia was explaining us earlier about the wider ecological and integrity agenda, and where does that fit? Mindful also with the different theories of change that we can see depending on who you talk to. Great, thanks, and thanks to all the panelists so far for those great explanations. I'm imagining that it's a lot of content and a lot of reflection for you all, depending on if you're joining from a climate justice perspective or economic justice perspective, but hopefully it's a lot of good food for thought, and it's of course just the beginning of conversations. So last but definitely not least, we wanted, of course, to have also this discussion and hearing from the more local and indigenous perspective. And so we want to hear from Carlos Lozano about his vision on this nexus between the ecological agenda and the FFD. So Carlos Lozano is the Secretary of Indigenous Youth of the FEPICESA. He has been leading youth representation and leadership in different processes, such as the FOSPA, the Amazon Summit, and the Pan-Amazon Bioeconomy Forum. So Carlos is really the perfect speaker to talk us through and share his thoughts with us today. Oops, I didn't have my camera on, sorry. Carlos, the floor is yours. Gracias.
Hola a todos, muchas gracias. Sí logran escucharme, ¿no? ¿Puedes confirmarme, por favor, si me escuchan? Porque la
Se
señal
escucha
aquí en
bien,
territorio
Ricardo.
es un poco
Sí.
débil. Ya, listo. Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos. Bueno, buenos días porque acá en Perú todavía es temprano. Es un honor dirigirme a todos ustedes en este webinar para poder compartir la perspectiva justamente de un joven indígena y del sur global sobre la importancia de nuestra participación en estos procesos de financiamiento para el desarrollo. Quiero iniciar mencionando que siempre nos han dicho que estas decisiones sobre la deuda externa y el comercio internacional, de los impuestos globales también, son temas ajenos a nosotros, que pertenecen a expertos, economistas y grandes políticos. Pero obviamente sabemos que esto no es cierto. Lo que se decide en estos foros repercute directamente en nuestras comunidades, en nuestros territorios y también en nuestras vidas. Las decisiones tomadas en foros internacionales sobre deuda externa, comercio internacional y políticas fiscales tienen repercusiones directas en nuestros territorios
So on
amazónicos.
have direct
Por ejemplo,
consequences in our
los
Amazon
acuerdos
territories,
comerciales que promueven la
commercial
explotación de
agreements
recursos
promoting
naturales
exploitation
sin
of
considerar el
natural resources
consentimiento de
without
las comunidades locales ha llevado a la creación de áreas naturales protegidas en el Perú, restringiéndonos el acceso de las comunidades indígenas a nuestros territorios ancestrales. Estas decisiones, aunque buscan en teoría la conservación, a menudo se implementan sin nuestra participación, afectando nuestras formas de vida y vulnerando nuestros derechos. Yo les pediría que miren el caso, por ejemplo, del Parque Nacional Cordillera Azul en Perú. Nos dicen que es para conservar la biodiversidad, pero nunca nos consultaron a las comunidades indígenas que vivimos allí desde tiempos ancestrales. La organización que administra este parque, que es el CIMA, ha vulnerado nuestros derechos y sin nuestro consentimiento ha vendido bonos de carbono a empresas transnacionales que contaminan nuestro planeta. Nos arrebatan la tierra en nombre de la conservación mientras permiten que otros destruyan la vida en otras partes del mundo, lucren con nuestros bosques y concesionen para la explotación de recursos, dejando sin efecto y sin sentido, pues, el conservar con un área natural protegida. En mi comunidad solemos tener una costumbre muy bonita y eso quiero comentarles. Y es que los indígenas sembramos en el camino hacia las chacras árboles frutales y solo tomamos los frutos que necesitamos para que todos los que caminan por ahí puedan disfrutarlos. Pero el mundo que han construido a nuestro alrededor no entiende esa lógica. Nos imponen un sistema donde unos pocos acaparan los frutos de la tierra mientras muchos otros quedan sin nada. La deuda externa asfixia a nuestros países, nos obligan a priorizar el pago a bancos y organizaciones financieras en lugar de invertir en salud, educación o protección de nuestros territorios. ¿Cómo podemos hablar entonces de desarrollo si nuestras comunidades siguen empobrecidas, perseguidas y desplazadas? Estas decisiones no solo perpetúan el extractivismo y la explotación de nuestra Pachamama, de nuestra tierra, sino que también incrementa las violaciones de derechos humanos. Las mujeres, familias, niños y jóvenes indígenas guardianes de los bosques del sur global sufrimos directamente los impactos de estas políticas. Las persecuciones a los líderes y dirigentes indígenas es parte de esta terrible historia. A los que defienden la vida, los territorios, los bosques, los asesinan o los silencian con amenazas. Sé de esto en carne propia, pues mi abuelo, un dirigente indígena muy reconocido acá, fue asesinado por defender su tierra, por oponerse al avance del extractivismo y las economías ilegales como sembríos de coca. Mi familia fue desplazada, arrancada de su comunidad y lo más terrible es que esto se ha vuelto acá casi normal. ¿Cuántos más deben morir? Esa es la pregunta que todos los días nos hacemos acá. Mientras en estos foros internacionales se discuten impuestos globales y regulaciones económicas, en nuestros territorios el extractivismo avanza sin freno. Empresas mineras, petroleras, agroindustriales destruyen la Amazonía con la complicidad de los gobiernos. amparados por acuerdos comerciales que nunca consultaron con nosotros y que incluyen dentro nuestros territorios. Nos dicen que estos proyectos traerán desarrollo, pero lo único que nos dejan es despojo, contaminación y violencia. A pesar de todo, estamos aquí, en representación de muchos. He tenido la oportunidad de estar en algunos espacios internacionales, pero somos pocos los jóvenes indígenas que logramos llegar. Y aunque nuestra voz es potente, no basta. No basta con ser uno o dos en un foro. Necesitamos ser varios, exigiendo cambios reales. Es crucial que se reconozca la importancia de nuestra participación en estos espacios. Nuestra perspectiva es esencial para garantizar que las políticas de financiamiento para el desarrollo sean inclusivas, equitativas y respetuosas de los derechos de las comunidades indígenas. Solo a través de una participación activa y significativa podremos asegurar que el desarrollo no se logre a expensas de nuestras vidas, culturas y territorios. La próxima conferencia internacional sobre financiación para el desarrollo, que se celebrará en Sevilla, representa una oportunidad única para avanzar hacia un sistema financiero global más justo, inclusivo y sostenible. Les voy a contar otra costumbre muy bonita que tenemos, ya para ir finalizando. Cuando un indígena nace, nace con una responsabilidad. En nuestras manos están nuestros hermanitos que vienen después, pues los padres deben dedicarse al campo y el hermano o hermana mayor cuidar de los más pequeños. ¿Y esto qué quiere decir? Pues que nacemos con una responsabilidad que es cuidarnos, querernos y protegernos. Y por eso estamos aquí, porque sabemos que nuestra lucha no es solo para nosotros, sino para quienes vienen después. No podemos aceptar que en los espacios donde se define el futuro de la economía global, nuestras voces sean ignoradas. Y es urgente que los pueblos indígenas y en especial los jóvenes estemos presentes en estos debates porque lo que está en juego no es solo dinero, sino es nuestras vidas, nuestra dignidad y el futuro de nuestras culturas. No puede haber desarrollo sin justicia, no puede haber sostenibilidad sin derechos humanos y no puede haber futuro sin los pueblos indígenas. Es momento de que el mundo lo entienda. Gracias por su atención y por abrir este espacio para nuestras voces.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for bringing us back to the concrete implication of a broken system, first of all, and your clear example are really a lot of good illustrations for us all to have that in mind when we engage with the process, but also to remember to remind us about the cruciality of meaningful participation and ensuring that everyone, but specifically youth and indigenous people, have a right to participate at every stage of the processes to ensure we lead to fair and equitable conclusion in Sevilla. So thank you so much for this. We have now, well, a bit less than expected, but that's always the case, a few minutes for Q&A. So I'll maybe ask the different panelists to put their cameras on so that we can see you, and invite participants to raise their hands if they have any question or comments. Because we are many on this call and we have not so much time left, I'll require you to be as brief as possible to have different voices and hear from different people. And then we'll have closing remarks from Carola, and then we close. So anyone who has a question, reflection, remarks, or addition to what has been shared, please use the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen and just feel free to contribute. Yes? Shamim Nyanda, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Maybe for me to just quickly, directly go to the point of my question, or rather, this is Shamim from Debt for Climate. And I would really like to understand how is the FFD planning to tackle the issue of unfairly high interest rates imposed especially on African countries compared to the global north in the name of risk assessment, in the name of investments cannot come to Africa because, the global media has put this continent in the context of, it is not a safe continent. It is not a good place to invest. So whenever all these investors come in, they come with all these high risk assessment rates and high interest rates. So I would like to know, because many of the African nations they need to prioritize social spending over credit profits, and that is not the case at the moment. And of course, also looking at what mechanisms does the FFD propose to ensure that this unconditional debt cancellation for countries in debt distress, particularly those impacted by climate disasters, are also foreseen. More of how is FFD changing the narrative that already exists? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I'll just check if there's any other question to the panelists, and then we can address those. I don't see any other hands, and I just checking the chats. I don't see any others for now. So who from the panel wants to address Shahim's question? We can have different answers, but who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah, I can start, and Flora will complement because there are many points to your comment. Thank you so much for this. On the one hand is the larger demand of the FFD mechanism that refers to a UN convention that tackles precisely that in a comprehensive manner and not just country by country case, but really also sets the rules for addressing all of the nuances that you're referring, like the situation of countries that are the most impacted, that are already declaring a default or that have been impacted by ecological emergencies. And on the other hand, there is this proposal in tackling, as I said, the regulation of credit rating agencies, because this is related to what you were saying about how they're saying that our countries are more at risk for investors, and therefore the interest rates go higher, whereas the developed countries pay almost no interest. And so whereas it is their actions that are, again, shifting their externalities towards the global south. So there are like many points of entry that are referred to, and you also tackled that there is a need for more public finance that Mariana also addressed on the expansion of the notion of tax in the agenda. But also you refer to the role of how then it's prioritizing the private spending as opposed to the public spending, and that is also related to the great job that the private finance working group is doing. So I'll give the floor to Flora also to address that dimension.
Thank you, Emilia. And thanks a lot, Shamim. That's a really relevant point. I think, Emilia, as Emilia already mentioned, one of the key demands that we have as FFD, the civil society FFD mechanism, is around the UN multilateral debt workout mechanism. But I think specifically to your point, this discussion on credit rating agencies and how, as Emilia was saying, the ratings are detrimental and unfair to countries in the South and especially African countries, as you were suggesting. This is a very key point, and we have a demand as mechanism to review and regulate the current credit rating agencies system, and also a proposal to create a public credit rating agency that could be hosted in the UN, for instance. So for more details on the language of the demand, we can share some resources for that. But this is a point that we've been hearing throughout the FFD4 preparatory process, different G77 countries and especially African countries highlighting the credit ratings as a key issue. So this is something that I think there is a lot of potential for hopefully getting something into the FfD4 outcome document that is about regulating the current rating system in a different way that is more fair. So I think that's it.
Thanks so much, both of you. I don't know, Mariana, Carlos, if you want to add anything on that question. No?
Good answers.
Cool. I don't see any other hands. I imagine oh, perfect. Ivana, and then Elia. Perfect. Please, Ivana. We can't hear you, at least on my end, I can't. Okay, I see at the other side there. Ivana, if you can hear us, maybe you can try to unmute and then remute yourself. Sometimes that works. In the meantime, maybe I can ask Elia to come in from Debt for Climate, and then we take Ivana. Elia, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, nice. So yeah, I have one question and one comment. My question for the panelists would be, and it was talked about like that, for example, the root of the climate crisis is economic system, so also known as the global racial capitalism. And I see how the FFD is like addressing different financing aspects and how that's connected to climate, for example. But how can the FFD address the economic roots, for example, of the climate crisis? What's the mechanisms there? And the comment I have is that we as Debt for Climate with other groups started in the Equidad conference that we had last week, already mobilizing towards the FFD4 for international actions and action in Sevilla, and we would just share a message with you in the chat so you can join us. We have a signal group, and that we can be many people to push for these very important topics in less than 5 months. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I see there is a question in the chat as well, so I'll maybe take that one too. And I think Ivana has been kicked out, so let's see. So we have Elia's question for the panelists, and then we have another question from Ilaria in the chat. Are there champions countries, quote unquote, related to the objective that you outlined? How do you see geopolitical tension, including the new US administration, affecting the process? So 2 questions. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Mariana, you can, because you didn't speak in the previous round. And then Carlos.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Elia, for your question. I mean, in terms of like going back to how FFD can really tackle the roots of the climate needs, it goes back a lot to the climate finance question, especially when we have to link how climate action can be addressed, how much countries can deal with climate action, how much fiscal space there is. And that's why when we think FFD as an opportunity to really challenge and build, transform the current economic financial systems, it's really about not, for example, climate finance being a charity, an additionality, but actually how can you transform the systems? So, for example, last year, a number of climate groups have been working together under the Pay Up campaign to transform financial systems. So when it is a space for us to really connect the dots between opening up the fiscal space for climate and development action, connecting the dots between the debt, taxation, and really open up the fiscal space, the governance and participation. That's when, to address the climate action that we need to address and have the finance to deal with the adaptation, loss and damage, just energy transition. It all depends on the right finance, and for developing countries to be in charge of these actions. So FFD is is a chance to really challenge the process and the space. And that's why it is such an important issue for the climate as a cross-cutting issue, as is gender. And because we have the representation of all countries, it's really the right opportunity to do that. Touching on Ilaria's point on some champions, I think it has been great, for example, to see how some of the southern countries have been present in this space, especially calling in terms of the right types of reform it comes in terms of the debt, addressing the debt agenda, a number of others. And if we see to some extent more voices from the Global South, or the likes of G77, United, and a number of other groups, I'm quite sure that we can bring some ambition to these negotiations. But I'm sure that Emilia and Flora will add to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe looking at Carlos first. I don't know if you want to add anything on the question you had. Sorry about that. Or if Emilia or Flora, you'd like to jump in.
Maybe I can jump in. I think Mariana answered well. Just to add, I think Africa Group we have seen as a major champion throughout the FFD process, both in the tax and debt issues, and more specifically, but broadly, yeah, they have been just amazing. And I'm reading a question from Ivana on the chat on debt for climate swap, so maybe I can try to start answering this, and other colleagues can address as well, because I think that's quite an important issue that indeed we do hear a lot of developing countries advocating for it, but we see it as a problematic issue because it doesn't really go to the root of the debt problem. So it is indeed can be politically helpful for developing countries because it immediately can free up some funds and fiscal space in a more short-term oriented perspective in terms of especially countries that are dealing with fiscal space constraints. A debt swap can vary in the short term support in a minor way, but we see it as actually not really a long-term solution, and it's many ways used as a means of legitimizing and raising the responsibilities of donor or creditor countries on illegitimate debt. So it's not really an effective instrument in reducing debt levels in the long term, and it's not dealing with the inherent flaws of the international debt architecture, is not dealing with the responsibilities of the North to provide reparations and to cancel debt and to address all their historical issues that they have with basically, since colonialism have been keeping countries of the South trapped in debt cycles that are not going to be solved by these debt swaps. And in fact, when we look at, for instance, a climate for debt swapped, or these days we're seeing all kinds of themes for debt swaps. They always bear some sort of conditionality. So it is a system that is, again, a creditor country telling a debtor country what they can do with their money. So this is also another point of concern that we have. There's also a lot of lack of transparency and accountability in those mechanisms. Not a lot of community or civil society participation or engagement. So there's a lot of risk of greenwashing. So in general, I think we see it with a lot of concern and with a careful approach to this. I can maybe leave it at that and see if others want to complement.
Thanks very much, Flora. Emilia, I see there is a specific question for you in the chat from Ivana, and maybe you want...
¿Puedo participar?
Sí, claro. Go ahead.
Lo que quería mencionar es que, resaltando que es importante iniciar, ¿no? Iniciar y construir, porque en realidad quizás en todo no vamos a tener los mejores efectos, pero es importante podernos dar cuenta de qué cosas se está haciendo mal para poder hacer mejor las cosas. Aquí en Perú, yo supongo que cuando crearon las áreas naturales protegidas pensaron en conservar, pero en el transcurso han existido muchos conflictos y quizás porque de una u otra forma generan beneficio también para algunas organizaciones, como en este caso es el CIMA, ya no hacen caso a nuestros conflictos. Pero el hecho de construir y tener este espacio para poder mejorar las cosas es importante. Entonces, yo lo que podría resaltar es tener este inicio, poder construir mejor las cosas y poder enfocarnos en poder solucionar los problemas que tenemos en cada uno de nuestros países, ¿no? Porque estoy escuchando que en África también las cosas tienen otras complicaciones, ¿no? Y es mejor resaltarlo eso. Solo eso quería resaltar. Gracias.
Thank you, Carlos. So now we are close to the wrap-up time, but Emilia, maybe there is a specific question for you in the chat, and I guess you maybe have some additional points to share, and then I'll give the floor to Carola to wrap us up.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to support what Carlos was saying on the need to realize also how the ecological agenda and the climate agenda can be taken over by colonial and imperial dynamics, and very much on their behalf to push for all of these kinds of measures that displace communities that are having negative impacts on behalf of these green conservation agendas, etc. So it is very important to analyze what is being proposed as a green policy from the point of view of the macroeconomic dimension, but also at the point where Carlos was pointing out, like, is it threatening the material conditions of life? Which is precisely what also not only the knowledge that indigenous peoples bring to the table, but also a feminist knowledge of the social reproduction. Precisely when we have the tension of capital versus life, this economic system is prioritizing the logics of capital as opposed to the logic of life. And we're trying to bring a feminist notion that is not anthropocentric solely, but is really going in depth about what is the sustainability of life implying. And this is not only, as I was saying, a non-monetized economy that is pertaining just to humans, but also to the entire biosphere cycle. So this is where we're having a feminist demand on these respects. And so far, the zero draft is again commodifying women as their role and their work is to benefit economic growth. And so there is a lot of work to do also in the feminist agenda, and happy to go deep into that. But for the time being, just say that we do have to have like a comprehensive vision, and with the strengthening of many social movements at the same time, no movement has the sole solution. So we definitely need to come into alliance and work together. And thank you so much for joining this webinar. Thank you also to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much. Carola, I'll maybe invite you to close and give us the final words.
Well, thank you so much for this great webinar. I think all of the panelists make it very clear why it is important to participate, to get involved in this process, and the opportunities that arise from the fourth conference to come in Sevilla related to the finance for development process. Thank you so much. I would like to say that we, Emilia Reyes, myself from Latindad, and Rodolfo Bejarano are the co-facilitators of the working group that is within the CSO FfD mechanism. We see the topics related to climate, to environment issues, and this group is new, and we want more people to be more involved, and that is why this webinar was an attempt to give more information, to invite all the people to join this group. If you are interested, please write to Emilia or write me an email. I'm sending our emails in the chat. Because we want to work on a strategy, we want to be there proposing things. This FFD4 conference gives us the opportunity to really push for deep reforms, these transformative and structural changes we want to see in the economic system, in the financial system, in the trade system that, of course, are completely related to environmental impacts, the 9 environmental crises that we are already facing and that are having the impacts that Carlos, for example, was mentioning. It is about really confronting the system. And in these kind of spaces that are more democratic, because it's a UN space, we want to see these results. We want to see deep transformations. We want to see good decisions arising from this political will that we need to also push for in our countries. So that is very important to do. And we want you all to be part of this group, to be part of the discussions, to be part of the proposals we want to take to Spain in June. And before that, we have a lot of moments also in New York to discuss about this. So I would like to just thank the panelists for making it so clear about the relationship and the opportunities we have to be more involved in this process. Thank you, Carlos, for really sharing with us this tough situation that your family had to live because of extractivism, because of these decisions and policies that are affecting the local communities, that are affecting the South. And we really want to help transform these systems that are so unfair and really push for a global economic reform that leads to really save the planet, but also make and achieve different kinds of models, of economic models, economic systems that are more fair, more sustainable, and where all the countries can really negotiate in the same with the same opportunities, which is not happening right now, related to debt, related to trade, related to tax. So that is why it is so important. Thank you so much, Rebecca, also for moderating. Thanks to the communication team, to Marisol, to Angela, to our interpreters. Thank you so much to all the people that has joined this webinar. We will have more to continue these discussions and to try to explain a little bit more about the relationship with the other working groups that are part of the CSO mechanism. So have a nice day, and thank you all for being here. And if you're not part of the group, please write to us and we will include you. Goodbye. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.